So welcome everyone to NSS Connections. As you know, we're visiting Ed Fraughton in his sculpture studio in Utah. Ed is a founding member of the National Academy of Western Art and longtime member of the National Sculpture Society. He was elected as a sculptor member in 1973, advanced to fellow in 1977, and served on the board in 2002. Mr. Fraughton was honored with the Henry Herring Award in 2010 for the Pioneer Courage Monument, a commissioned work for the First National Bank of Omaha, Nebraska. In 2018, the NSS Board of Directors elected Ed as a member emeritus in recognition of services which, in their estimation, merited this distinction. When I asked Ed about doing a virtual studio visit and sharing his personal story as a sculptor, we realized the challenge was how to share 60 years of experience in less than an hour. He offered to prepare a short autobiographical film, which he miraculously pulled together over a long weekend. So we will now zoom to Utah, to the 12,000 square foot Fraughton studio, and please join me in welcoming Ed Fraughton and his studio manager of 40 years, who happens to also be his son, Ted. Ted and Ed, thanks so much for being here with us tonight. For the rest of you who are out there in cyberspace, kindly remain muted and ask any questions as you think of them in the chat room. We had in excess of 125 RSVPs, so it will be very distracting if everyone starts talking at once. Thanks so much. So welcome again, Ed and Ted. Would you like to tell us maybe a little bit about the film you prepared before we project it, and then we'll take questions afterwards?
Well, I'll just take a minute. First of all, thank you, Gwen, for a great introduction. This is Ted as my right-hand man, even though he's sitting on my left here. But he's a younger version of what I used to look like. A level of energy I used to be able to work with. But I'm honored to have Ted here with me, and my wife is sitting in as well, Anne, and I wish I could introduce her on screen. But Anne has been a great, there she is. She'll sneak in. Anne has been a great support all these years, and I think every artist knows without the support of a mate who will stand up to all the trials and tribulations that come along with doing what we do. We follow our passion and hope it leads to good places. So I've been very fortunate over the years. I've worked hard. And I thought in preparing this film, I thought rather than jittering around with either an iPad or a cell phone, it might save time and be of a little more interest. But in this film, I thought, since most people really don't know me, maybe many know my work, certainly, but not me on a personal level, I thought a little bit of autobiography, a little bit of history, a little bit of maybe fundamental training, and at least the foundational side of doing sculpture, and then more advanced training and a little philosophy where my ideas came from. I mean, the birthing process of having profound ideas, or at least hopefully profound. And you never know when you start a project how it's going to go, but you search in clay. Clay is easy to put on and remove and change, and it's malleable so we can change it. But at some point, it begins to take on a life of its own. So enjoy the film, and after we'll have a Q&A session if you'd like. But we're honored to be here, and with that, Gwen, I think you can go ahead and run the film, the video.
Thank you.
From the moment we take our first breath, each of us begins a unique journey. Life is an adventure into the unknown. First, we must discover who we are. Then we begin to comprehend the world around us. Not long after I was born, I began to develop a profound curiosity about everything. Yes, it is said that curiosity killed the cat. However, we should add, satisfaction brought it back. At my youngest age, I remember being awestruck by smells, tastes, warmth and coldness, by light, colors, how dazzling and fascinating everything looked. At first, nothing made sense, but later on, by searching for answers as to what, how, and why everything existed, including me, life began to take on more purpose and meaning. Curiosity. Curiosity is the first step in learning how to create a worthy piece of art. Wilson Hurley, a fabulous friend and fellow artist, told me of the moment he was struck to give up a thriving legal practice to become an artist. "Eddie," he said, "I finally decided that before I die, I want to paint at least one good picture." Wilson went on to become one of America's premier landscape painters. Passion. Passion comes next. To create a great work of art, I'm convinced that an artist must fall in love with one subject. Passion can never come out of a work of art unless passion has gone into its creation. That requires thousands of hard hours of study, tedium, and practice to develop one's skills, doing the necessary research, then having the patience to never quit until having done one's very best. After the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and rationing, I was taught that you, quote, never cast a piece of art until it is worthy. Tools and materials are important. What will the finished product be produced in? Leather, fabric, wood, stone, bronze, or polished stainless steel? Italian sculptors worked in marble because it was beautiful and so abundantly available. Ancient Egyptians chose granite and other hard stones not because they were so readily available, but because they seemed so permanent. Nordic ancestors used wood because wood was indigenous to their region. Every material has its unique characteristics. Tools, being mere extensions of one's brain and hands, were invented by artists to work with whatever materials happened to be available. When working in clay, the hand is the most sensitive tool of all. Other tools are needed only to cut, measure, draw upon, to blend or add textures. Nice thing about clay is it can be both temporary or permanent. But sketching in natural clay kept moist or turned into a wax or oil-based medium is a marvelous way to create conceptual models. The world of sculpture is a wonderful world, and as members of the National Sculpture Society, we follow a marvelous tradition. Formed by the best of the best American sculptors, these are our mentors, teachers, fellow compatriots. Their inspiration and motivation continue to guide us. My formal training came from Dr. Avard Fairbanks, a supreme anatomist and student of James Earl Fraser. I was fortunate indeed that National Sculpture Society President Granville Carter became my sponsor. Today, I can only apologize for not being more active in participating in our annual exhibits, but I hope all that I do positively reflects upon the Society and its long-term objectives. I thank President Carter for this opportunity. Personal history. I was born 6 months before the outbreak of World War II. Until age 18, I spent my entire life in Park City, an old western mining town in the mountains of Utah. Our family had little money, but I was lucky to have a mother who was artistic and industrious. My stepfather, a veteran of World War I, worked very hard as a railroad section hand just to make ends meet. In about 1953, he came home waving a letter in his hand. He told us he was getting a $200 pay raise. He would now be making $2,000 a year, which equated to $1 an hour. I always loved to draw and make music. My first guitar was built out of an old cigar box, a piece of firewood and baling wire. Didn't make much music, though, just a little twang. My art career began when Mrs. Gibbons, my fourth grade teacher, entered a crayon drawing I had made of the old Park City train depot into a contest where it won a national award. Around age 8, I took odd jobs, first delivering papers. Then at age 12, I washed down all the walls in the grade school. That fall, I became a full-time custodian's helper at the high school. I loved music, skiing, fishing, and building things with my hands. Winter weekends, I worked at a small ski resort. And summers, I hauled hay on a sheep ranch. No matter what I had, which wasn't much, I was always looking for a way to fix or improve it, make it better. I discovered early on that practice doesn't make perfect, it only makes permanent. The trick is learning how to love your work and practice improving. Otherwise, your imperfections only become more and more fixed, more permanent. Great art has little to do with talent. It is far more about hard work and forever improving. At age 26, I was asked to organize an arts and crafts program for a newly formed Job Corps center in Clearfield, Utah. 1 year later, the Office of Economic Opportunity in Washington, D.C., told us we had the finest arts and crafts program in the entire nation. Denied the opportunity to then complete my final quarter of work on a master's degree at the University of Utah. In 1967, I instead launched into my full-time career in sculpture. The following year, I completed my first monumental commission, the Mormon Battalion Soldier at Presidio Park in San Diego, California. Shortly thereafter, I was elected a member of the National Sculpture Society. And by 1973, I was invited into a newly formed organization, the National Academy of Western Art in Oklahoma City, where I won my first gold medal for a piece of sculpture called Where Trails End. Over the ensuing years, I took home many more medals. Having outgrown my first work area in our home and small studio space, in 1973 our family purchased an old abandoned church, which we converted into our home sculpture studio, and after digging out under the chapel, installed a foundry where several additional monumental works were completed. For example, they included All Is Well, for the Brigham Young Cemetery in Salt Lake City, the Spirit of Wyoming for the state capitol building in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the Cadet for Randolph-Macon Academy in Front Royal, Virginia. Clearing the hallway for Rock Springs, Wyoming. Study time for Ricks College in Rexburg, Idaho. In the year 2000, I was invited to join Kent Uhlberg and Blair Buswell in the creation of the largest contiguously connected sculpture endeavor in North America, a westward migration Pioneer Courage monument in Omaha, Nebraska. My first conceptual models were created in our old church, but we needed more space, which is the building we are touring today. That monument ended up being 5 city blocks long. Commissioned by the First National Bank of Omaha, that endeavor, similar in scale to Paul Moore's wonderful Oklahoma land rush, took over 10 long years to create. My portion consisted of 36 major elements, including 4 large draft horses, 2 riding and pack horses with large game animals, a milk cow, a dog, 4 oxen, 2 covered wagons, and 15 people of varying shapes and sizes. As you will see, some of the clay remnants, although somewhat dilapidated, still reside in my studio. Studio tour. Tidiness is not my number one virtue. As both sculptor and inventor, you will see that I throw nothing away. While we briefly walk through the studio, perhaps it might be appropriate to talk about ethics. Ethics. Most of us are aware that 1893, the founding year of the National Sculpture Society, was a very different time, a time I refer to as the golden age of American architecture, painting, and sculpture. Along with founders Stanford White, Augustus St. Gaudens, Daniel Chester French, Carl Bitter, Herbert Adams, and later Anna Hyatt Huntington, Bessie Potter Vano, Laura Gardine Fraser, and Malvina Hoffman. Then architects and other luminaries such as Louis Sullivan, Bernard Maybeck, Frank Lloyd Wright, Winslow Homer, John Singer Sargent, and Louis Comfort Tiffany were also producing their finest works. At that time, it seemed wise and proper to create a climate for training and mentoring young artists. But it was also important to create a profession that advocated higher ethical and moral standards. In today's world of nonconformity, suddenly it has become popular to cast tradition and ethics aside. Art education has dummied down all the standards once important in art. Regardless of who created the greatest works of history, or for what reasons, we seem so arrogant as to justify either copying or, in the name of political correctness, even destroying great works of art. Was Andy Warhol a plagiarist by copying Campbell's soup cans? Or simply coloring over photos made by others of Marilyn Monroe's lips to gain attention, fame, or fortune? Are people who plagiarize James Earl Fraser's End of the Trail monument justified because he failed to register a copyright, or because his art is now part of the public domain? That piece takes the award for having been one of the most highly plagiarized pieces of American art. One of the reasons institutions such as the National Sculpture Society exist is to create and preserve the highest technical, aesthetic, ethical, and moral standards. Yes, traditionally, part of the learning process has always included copying other artists' works. However, when that is done, a proper attribution should also be included. For example, as an experiment to once see what I could draw using a ballpoint pen, I copied a Frederick Remington drawing. But as soon as I did so, I also wrote in the corner, quote, Remington copy, end quote, then signed my name. Today, people who copy indiscriminately, without attribution, do so with one thing in mind: money. We see copies of copies of copies of Remingtons, of Michelangelo's David, or Bertel Thorvaldsen's Christus. Yes, there is a legal limit to the life of copyrights, 70 years after the death of the artists in America, but even so, in the arts, shouldn't moral and ethical standards be even higher? Bartholdi died in 1904. St. Gaudens in 1907, Frederick Remington in 1909, and Daniel Chester French in 1931. Some artists may not make a literal copy, but a copy derived from another artist's original concept. That ethical argument becomes a bit more dicey. The question is, would such an artist have even created such a work without seeing the original artist's version of a specific subject? Then there are galleries and clients who also see a great advantage in abusing or plagiarizing works of others. Or to gain greater control, they might even seek to deprive artists of their own original creative copyrights. Maintaining integrity are reasons for artists to come together, to cooperate in institutionalizing the highest moral and ethical standards in art. Isn't that part of the main reason we exist? Originally, this statement was published in every National Sculpture Review. Perhaps this would be a good time to rethink reviving it. secret formula for creating profound sculpture. Sculpture is not the ability to copy the likeness of a model in a specific pose. Rather, it is comprehending what one is truly looking at. Proportion, design, anatomy, and the mathematical principles that Greeks, when trying to define beauty, established what have become known as divine principles. Otherwise, one is forever stuck in a profound state of mediocrity. No, as I said earlier, talent alone is not enough. The skeleton is the architectural frame. Everything else, muscles, viscera, and connective tissue, only exist to make the frame articulate, move. Understanding the spinal column and how it moves is really the key to creating dynamics, a way of putting life into one's work. Kent Uhlberg sets the supreme example. How did he choose to create geese in flight? He couldn't simply pose them, then copy them. And where did his idea to transition from traditional bronze into polished stainless steel to give timelessness to the ultimate material they would be cast in come from? The answer is really quite simple. Serving many years as a taxidermist, he learned how to dissect animal cadavers. Putting exhibits together in a natural setting required engineering, superb creativity. In my case, my mentor, Dr. Fairbanks, received his PhD in anatomy. Each year, the University of Utah Medical School granted him a human cadaver to teach a gross anatomy lab to art and physical therapy students. I not only took, but then helped teach subsequent sessions. Later, I even asked permission to monitor classes with pre-med students. After studying art history, I thought, if Michelangelo believed he needed to study gross anatomy, what kind of sculptor could I ever expect to be if I chose not to? Anatomy, design, and using correct proportions are foundational to everything. They open the door to all other creative thoughts. All animals have the same basic structural elements with the same anatomical names. They are simply shaped and proportioned and wrapped up differently. Only you can decide how successful I or anyone else has been in applying that knowledge to the creation of good, sound sculpture.
While that's ending, I don't know if you can hear me, but I apologize for the jitteriness of the video, but I wanted to keep the resolution as high as possible. And of course, the bandwidth problems on using Zoom are very limiting. But I hope that was informative. So back to you, Gwen.
We are open to questions if anyone has any. We'd love to hear from you. I see some comments coming in through the chat room. One question, Ed, was that you showed a piece in the film of a male figure it was on a swivel base. He was reaching for his top hat and had a cane in the other hand. What is that piece?
That's actually the person that I was sculpting was Roy Folger, an old friend from California who was known by a lot of people and sadly passed away. So a friend commissioned me to do that. And rather than just do a portrait, you know, a likeness of his face, I thought it might be kind of nice to create something in action that really represented what Roy's life was all about. He was a little like a ringmaster in a circus. He wore different costumes. He was in different plays. He did all these character things, and all of his friends loved him because of just his personality and his theatrical abilities. So that's what I was attempting to create. I call it, instead of calling it by his name, I called it the Maker of a Million Smiles.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Thank you. You know, one of the things I've tried to do is everything I do, I take a new approach to it. I approach it as if I'm not the same sculptor. I'm looking for a new way of doing something that I've never done before. And perhaps as you look at it, I'm sure there's a recognizable characteristic in my work, but still, you know, some people do portraits, some people do human figures, some do animals, and they stick to that one thing, but I do it all. I do medallions. I like to do, my training was really in monumental sculpture. So every model I create, I'm thinking, what would this be like if I were to enlarge this into monumental scale? So I think of almost everything I do in monumental terms.
So we do have some questions. Two people have asked if you still work from live models, or do you, and the other question is, do you typically use a model?
You know, that's a great question, because typically I don't use models. And when I do, I create the composition first and figure out what I want to do. And then I use the model only to finish the piece. And of course, I make a lot of errors in, you know, in measuring and just the details. For example, a knee in a particular position has a particular character about it. And I don't always guess that right, but typically I create everything. I gave you a brief preview of something I'm working on right now that I haven't used models at all. And I'm not against models. I think models are really important, especially in the learning process. But once you know the figure, if you really know the figure, you know the dimensions, you know how it functions, you know how the structure, you can literally create a figure in any position. You know, often, in fact, on the internet, I saw the question about who did Michelangelo use for a model when he did David? Well, I answered that one and I said, well, I don't think he used any one particular individual for a model. He created it out of his own memory and capacity for knowing the kind of figure he wanted to create, and then perhaps used figures and sketches and drawings to refine or finish the model. But no, I think oftentimes when you use a model, the piece of sculpture or painting ends up looking like a facsimile of a specific person in a specific place doing a specific thing. Now that's genre art, but classic art is very different. It goes beyond genre and reaches for the stars. I mean, for the ideal. And that's kind of where my training came from. And that's what I strive to do with my work. Even that little piglet, you know, sitting there, I thought I ought to do just a very small study of some sow pig with some little piglets. Well, I was watching television and the septuplets were born. I had 6 little piglets in there, and I thought, oh, I've got to add a 7th. So this little 7th became the runt, and I put it right under the head of the sow. And so sometimes inspiration just comes to you while you're, you know, what's going on around you, and from the piece itself, it takes on a life of its own.
Thank you. Someone, Susan is asking, could you talk a little bit more about your foundry?
Oh, my foundry. I thought you said boundaries, but you said foundry.
Foundry, yeah. Now, I remember visiting you 20 years ago in Utah at your old studio, which I thought was gigantic. I was so impressed. I'm afraid I would get lost in the new one because you told me it's more than twice the size.
Well, the Foundry isn't really the right term, because when we got the project in Omaha, it was so huge that we couldn't do all the casting as well. So we moved to other foundries. Now, I realized when I first started, there were no foundries in the Intermountain West. There were foundries that did, occasionally they'd try a plaque, mostly sand casting, but no lost wax foundries. So that really started in a big way in Loveland, Colorado, with Zimmerman. Bob Zimmerman went gung ho. Classic Bronze in California were doing lost wax and using the new ceramic shell technique. Grant Speed from Utah learned how they were doing that. He had his bronzes cast there. So I actually borrowed some of Grant's materials, his mixer for mixing slurry originally, to do my own casting. So I started doing my own casting. And Grant and Hughes Curtis had an old, really it was a chicken coop, and he had converted it into a foundry. So the three of us got together and started doing our own casting. But very early on, in about 1973, I decided I needed to create my own foundry. In fact, Averitt Fairbank's son, Justin, tried to get a foundry going and asked me if I'd come to work for him, which I did. Worked for him for a year, finally had to leave, and that's when I joined the staff at the Job Corps. And right after that, started getting a few commissions. And when we moved into the new building, well, before we moved into it, I was trying to cast things in other foundries, and then I decided when we bought that old church building that we'd dig out under the basement and put a bronze foundry in. So for about 30 years, we did almost all of our own casting until the Omaha project. By then, there were a number of really fine foundries here in Utah that have done just great work on castings. So it was time to kind of turn the work over to them. So we really don't do our own foundry work these days. Ted still does a lot of retouching and repair work and so forth, but only on my work. We've never taken in work from other people. But that's what it took really to get my career going, was to do my own casting. Otherwise, and again, being an inventor, I'm always solving problems in a different way. And I was far ahead of a lot of the foundries in developing casting techniques. So actually, I taught quite a few of those who are in the foundry business today and helped them along, because I thought it was better for everybody if we had good foundries that could be relied on to do all the works. So that was the idea. I got into the foundry business because I had to, out of necessity. If any of you have read Malvina Hoffman's beautiful book on sculpture inside and out, she describes all the steps required in the foundry, and that's a great resource. I mean, I studied that book and many other books in the process of learning to do my own, but I wasn't near the seacoast where I could bury my bronzes in, sink them into the ocean for 2 weeks and pull them up, to create patinas. So a lot of that is study and research and just being diligent, making a lot of mistakes to learn what not to do, till finally you discover ways of solving problems that seem to work. And it has over these years. I feel like my curiosity is kind of the thing that's led the way in my entire career.
Well, Wesley Wolford in North Carolina is saying, I imagine your methods of enlargement have changed over the years. Could you speak about those methods?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in this day and age, we have digital enlarging, and many people are doing that. And engineers had digital ways of making prints many years ago. They used a code called G code to program their machinery. Well, that grew into, when we got personal computers and so forth. Well, now we have great digital cameras that can photograph things in the round and create what's called a point cloud. And this point cloud is just, well, sorry, I have to back up a little. I need to tell you about one of my inventions. I invented the system that has been officially adopted by the FAA for tracking aircraft, based on GPS, but I invented it before GPS. It's called ADS-B, if any of you are pilots, and you can look up my patent if you're interested. Well, what my system does is each aircraft would find its own position in three-dimensional space, transmit a position information, latitude, longitude, and altitude. And then if they broadcast that over the airways, then other pilots could plot that on a screen and see their relative position to one another. So that's the basic philosophy behind what I decided to do. When you can digitize, you look at a piece of sculpture, rotate it, scan it from all different angles, and create this point cloud. Every point, and there are millions of points, it's like the same thing as this invention I made. You plot latitude, longitude, and altitude, but in millions of points. Then you connect these points by triangles and create a skin over that. Now you have a virtual image of the small model that you've created for enlarging. Any engineer can take that data now and say, okay, I can enlarge that. And they go ahead and do it. And they cut it out of foam and they cut it in 3 dimensions, any scale that you want. The only problem with that is when you create the surface, now you've got to cover the surface with clay and resculpt it again. So I came up with a new method of doing my enlarging, where I bought the equipment, told my guys, we're going to take a different approach. Instead of cutting on a routing machine, we cut out all these parts, but instead of cutting the positive, we're going to cut the mold, because the digital information doesn't care whether you cut the positive or the negative shape. So we cut the negative shape, and you can only do 3-inch lifts at a time. And I end up with all these bricks, or blocks of styrofoam that now, it's actually polyurethane foam, but now we lay the clay up inside that mold. Then we pour polyurethane foam behind it to back it up, and we build our steel structure inside that. So when you take it apart, you have all these bricks, basically, that are parts of the sculpture enlargement that now you have to piece together. But they have clay on the outside. So now you don't have to tear the clay off to go in and adjust the armature. So what that did for me is it saved about 70% of the normal time it would take to do old-fashioned enlarging using a pointing system of some type, and just doing it by hand the hard way. So typically it would take me about 15 months to do a major monument. That's a figure, say 8 foot or 7.5 to 8 foot figure. 15 months. I cut the time down to about 2.5 months a piece. So over a 10-year period on the Omaha project, I did 36 major elements, which is like 3.5 major pieces of sculpture a year over a period of 10 years. So that's what creative thinking and inventing does for you. I mean, it helps you solve problems in a way that nobody else has adopted. Now, other people have tried doing what I do, and they've given up because it's so labor intensive. And I hired more people on the digital side to do my enlarging so that it would cut down on the amount of time I had to spend sculpting. But now, instead of readjusting my armature, I'm working on the surface. So actually, in 2.5 months, as opposed to 6 months, I was doing better work because I was spending more time on the refinement than I was on the physical part of correcting problems in the armature. So, that's kind of a complex answer, and it's not intended for the kind of the average viewer, but hopefully, being sculptors, you'll appreciate the effort that goes into sometimes inventing ways of doing things in a different way.
And we are recording this if anyone needs to listen to that again. So,
Well, I mean,
thank you. So
right.
I'm trying to take the questions in the order in which they were asked, so we're bouncing around a wee bit, but Katie is asking, how do you get people interested in realism?
Well, it's everywhere. You know, when I was studying art, I was caught between two worlds, the abstract world of art and the traditional. Everett Fairbanks came out of the mold of the golden age. I mean, he knew he didn't know, I don't know if he knew St. Gaudens, but he knew Daniel Chester French, for example. He knew, of course, he studied from James Earl Fraser. So that's the kind of training, and I got that through the first class I took was in sculpture history. So history develops an interest, you know, what has been done in the past. Now, I told you that I loved music. I loved engineering. I actually started my studies at the university in civil engineering. But the day came when I had to decide, what is it I want to do with my life? And I thought, well, there are a lot of engineers in the world. There are a lot of musicians, unless you're really exceptional. But I thought there aren't really a lot of great sculptors who are keeping this tradition of classical sculpture alive. And the instructors were telling us, you know, you have to develop a style of your own. And I thought, that's ridiculous. You study from the best of the best, and what comes out of you automatically is your style. You don't have to aim at developing a style that's going to infatuate the public and maybe lead to a few sales. No, you have to follow your heart, and I'm guilty of that. And poor Anne, she suffered through a lot of years of that because I follow my dream. And so classical sculpture to me, I got a book once called The History of World Sculpture by Germaine Bazin, who was a curator for the Louvre in Paris. And he covered the whole history of sculpture from the Lascaux caves in Europe. They were all color plates, beautifully done. Got up to the time of Rodin and Houdon. And suddenly, the next page had sculpture of Brancusi, Giacometti, all the modernists, Hans Arp. There was nothing in there of the history of American sculpture. None of these great American sculptors were included in the book. And in the text, he said, the Americans went to Europe and studied from the masters that were teaching in Paris and in Rome and Naples and in England and so forth. But he said they came back and simply imitated the style of the Europeans until Brancusi and Giacometti and others came along. Well, so I was asked to give a lecture once, and the subject I chose was missing pages from the history of world sculpture. And I showed some of the works that you saw in the film, but one of the most profound works ever was created by Henry Schrady, and it was the Grant Memorial at the base of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. He was never trained in Europe. In fact, he had typhoid fever, and his father was the doctor, one of the doctors who administered to Robert E. Lee, or excuse me, to
Grant?
Grant Grant. I got the two because I was thinking of Lee, and I'll tell that story in a second as well. Ulysses Grant, when he was dying of cancer, it was Henry Schrade's father, a physician who was caring for him. And it was Schrade also who did the Robert E. Lee monument that was recently taken down in Columbus, South Carolina. So the reason for telling this long story is most people have no clue about the history of what they're tearing down or why it was even created. Now, Henry Schrade worked 14 years on that monument. And it's one of the most sublime monuments, not only in American history, but you can include European history. You can go back and study the European sculptors and look at their works and see what's different about that work. So what is it that was so different about the American sculptors? Well, they learned the rudiments in the schools of classic sculpture. But then they came back to America and their work was very different, and it was different because they understood what freedom was all about. And it shows in their works. So this Schrade piece, when you go see it in person, study it from every single angle. And the passion that he put in to the cavalry and artillery group is one of the most profound statements ever in the history of art. So we, as members of the society, should remember our roots. We should study our beginnings and revere those who came before and set the example and have taught us and that allowed us to enter their world and participate. And hopefully that from the works that we do, we can add to their legacy as well and continue this. But we need to stand up, and I think artists don't organize very well. You know, musicians took the hint and they organized and they made copyrights worthy of something. But in America, the attorneys who write the copyright and patent rules, copyrights last for 70 years after the death of the artist, but patents, when I got my patent, only lasted 17 years, and the FAA just simply waited till my patents ran out and then announced a new technology for the use of airspace, and they announced my technology as being the basis behind it. So you have to follow your heart, your dreams. But when you do so intelligently, study, have a great curiosity, get in and dig and study and know what you're doing. And so when you do work, those things will influence your work. And there'll be a powerful influence on them, and you'll become much better for having done it. And I can testify to that because that's what I do. I read a lot, I study a lot, I work hard, I put in long, hard days, and still do that at age 82, and can't wait for the next day to come so I can tackle the problems all over again and destroy what I did the day before to make it better. And you can't, somebody once said, you can't save, you can't own anything until you can give it away. And the same principle is true, is you can't save or you can't create a great work of art until you're willing to destroy what isn't quite so great to make it better, or to take the chance on making it better. You know, you can always make it as good as you did before you destroyed it. So go ahead and take the risk and see if you can make it better.
So Ed, I think we have time for one more question, which is, we actually got, this is a popular question with a number of sculptor interviews that we've done. This is from Doug White, who's a sculptor and medalist in Michigan. He's asking, what kind of clay and or plastiline do you typically use? And he seems to recall an excellent portrait medal you did. He thinks was of Ronald Reagan, and he's wondering if you do any medallic work.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the last part of the question, but the clay I use, I used to use Chavant, or in the early days, Roma plastilina. For the first number of years, but of course, plastilina has sulfur in it and creates some problems. So I moved to Chavant clay. I needed a harder clay, and in the styling industry, the automotive design business, they used Chavant very heavily. I met Paul, I've forgotten his name, the owner of Chavant one year, and I asked him for some clay for sculpture, and I set up a dealership, but I said, I want to have a dealership price, but I don't want to have to sell clay, but I'll tell you what I'll do. Wherever I go, I loved their professional plastilina, so I used it for years. But whenever I did a workshop or around the country, I would recommend people buy Chavant clay. And he called me one day. He was visiting Utah. He was from Red Bank, New Jersey. It was the plant, but he said, I want to invite you and Ann to dinner tonight in Park City. And so we met him there, and he said, you may wonder why I'm inviting you to dinner. He said, since you started using and telling people about Chavant clay, we used to sell about 5 or 6 or 8% to sculptors. Now we're up to 20 or 25% of our clay goes to sculptors. And I can trace every sale either directly or indirectly to you. So I just wanted to say thank you. So it's a long story, but when we started working on now I should say about now Jack North now took over the company and does a great job, and they've created some new clays that are resistant to, I mean, they're non-sulfur clays, so you can put, when silicone molding material was invented, sulfur kills the catalyst. And so that's why they were trying to get away from sulfur in clays. And they created a Labo Touche clay, and I used that for a while, but I found it a little too sticky. And I've tried melting clays. When we did this big big project in Omaha, Nebraska, we needed a clay to put inside the mold, a clay that would melt. So we went to, what's it called, Ted? It has several names now because it's been through. It's somebody else can help me with it. It's a J.
It's JMac Classic Clay.
There you go, JMac. But JMac, I've used that quite a bit, and some people are using this soft. I'm not sure the name of it, but it's kind of a similar clay. So the reason for choosing clays really has to do more with sulfur, but sulfur was a suspension agent, and it's really a great suspension agent. So when they used synthetics, they had to come up with other suspension agents. So I still like that professional clay that Chavant makes. It just has a nice touch, and your tools stay clean. So that's why I chose the professional Chavant, but I don't use it too often because it's very hard to seal and then make a silicone mold on it later. So I force myself to use this JMac meltable clay. So hopefully that is a long enough answer to that.
So I think in closing, otherwise we'll go all night and you will definitely lose your voice. But I think I'm going to remove the spotlight so you can see everyone on the screen in gallery view. Which,
If I can find it on my little iPad, which I haven't used before.
and there are some more questions and comments, and please, anyone who I wasn't able to get to, please email us directly and we'll either get you in touch with Ted and Ed, or we'll answer it for you through them. But in closing, I'm going to read one of the comments. There are several. This one is from Stephen, saying, my sincere thanks to Ed for this presentation. You have always been an inspiration and a mentor to so many creative minds. And we know that's true, and we thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.